The camera freezes on Melania Trump, seated before Congress. Her posture is perfect, polished, almost statuesque, but her eyes give her away. A calm mask stretched over a tight unease. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett leans forward, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a blade. The chamber stills, every ear bending toward the moment that is about to unfold. Mrs. Trump. Crockett begins, measured but sharp. When you speak of service to this country, what exactly do you mean?
Ow!
The words echo, and instantly the room bristles. It isn't a polite inquiry. It's a challenge, and everyone knows it. Reporters' pens pause mid-scratch, aides shift in their seats, and a low murmur stirs the audience. Gasps ripple from the corners of the gallery, traveling like a wave that collides with the hushed silence. This isn't just testimony. It feels like an arena. The lights above, the sea of cameras, the thrum of anticipation, all of it transforms the moment into a political duel. With Crockett as the unflinching prosecutor and Melania as the reluctant witness, Melania adjusts her gaze, unblinking, her chin lifting in practiced grace. She's been here before, under scrutiny, judged for words, judged for silences. But Crockett isn't reading from a script or throwing a rehearsed softball. She is pressing against the very heart of legitimacy, dignity, and accountability, and she isn't flinching. The chamber leans forward. The air feels electric, heavy with the charge of confrontation. Crockett's eyes don't waver. She doesn't blink. Melania's practiced composure meets unrelenting fire. The tension crackles. Stretching tight as glass about to shatter, viewers across America hold their breath as the networks broadcast live. Pundits already whispering into hot mics. Will Melania hold her ground? Or will Crockett's sharpened blade of truth carve through the practiced performance of political elegance? The audience knows instinctively this isn't background noise. It's history being written in real time, and then Crockett leans in closer, her voice dropping but gaining weight. Each syllable heavy with intent. What she said next didn't just cut through the chamber, it ignited a clash no one in that room, or the country watching, would ever forget. Asterisk the moment between Melania Trump and Jasmine Crockett. It didn't just flicker across television screens. It surged like a current through American living rooms, coffee shops, and scrolling feeds. Because this wasn't an ordinary exchange. This was the Trump brand, sleek, polished, global, meeting Crockett's relentless progressive firepower in real time. For years, Melania had cultivated a role wrapped in mystery and restraint. She spoke sparingly, projected elegance, and wielded silence as both shield and weapon. She wasn't just Melania, and she was Trump. A figure whose every move carried the weight of a name that had already altered the American landscape. Sitting before Congress, she didn't represent just herself. She carried the symbolism of an entire empire, wealth, celebrity, and the aura of untouchability. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman forged in the courtroom, not in the marble halls of Fifth Avenue. Crockett represented the other America, the America that bore scars, that carried stories of being interrupted, dismissed, overlooked. Her voice was sharp not because it sought spectacle, but because it sought truth. And in a chamber long dominated by polished evasions, her questions struck like lightning. The stakes could not have been higher. On one side was the refined armor of diplomacy, carefully trained to endure scrutiny without cracking. On the other side was the raw edge of accountability, demanding that power really answer for its role in shaping lives beyond. The cameras and the headlines. America watched this collision of worlds unfold. Some saw Melania as grace under fire, poised against what they deemed unnecessary hostility. Others saw Crockett as the long-awaited voice cutting through layers of performance, asking what millions at home were already thinking. When does silence become complicity? When does polish become avoidance? This wasn't just about one testimony. It was about what kind of truth America values, the curated image of dignity or the unvarnished demand for justice. The clash struck at the very heart of the national psyche, where image and substance, silence and voice collide every day. On social media, the moment ignited instantly. Clips circulated under dueling hashtags. One side praised Melania for composure. The other celebrated Crockett for fearlessness. The divide itself became part of the spectacle, evidence that this confrontation was bigger than the two women seated in that chamber. It was cultural theater, a mirror held up to the nation. And in that chamber, Crockett knew exactly what was at stake. She understood that deference to power had to often drown out accountability. A soft tone and a polished smile could mask the sharpest evasions, and she was not about to let that happen here. Because for all of Melania's carefully honed diplomacy, Crockett's voice carried something far stronger, the unshakable weight of truth. And Crockett wasn't about to let diplomacy drown out accountability. For years, Melania Trump has moved through the public sphere like a figure carved. From glass-polished, reflective, but hard to read, her persona was deliberate, a shield of elegance and restraint that set her apart from the chaos often swirling around her husband. While Donald Trump thundered through rallies and headlines with bravado, Melania embodied quiet, distant poise. She was the image of calm in a storm of spectacle. Yet beneath that silence lay the very contradictions that made her both fascinating and divisive. To her admirers, she was the epitome of grace under impossible circumstances. They saw a woman unfairly scrutinized, judged for every gesture, every outfit, every word withheld. They called her dignified, unbothered, even regal, to her critics. However, that silence was not neutral. It was complicity. By choosing to stand beside Trump, to lend him her image, she became part of the machine that legitimized his politics. The contradictions defined her. She distanced herself from his scandals, rarely addressing them, projecting detachment when the headlines grew messy. Yet when it was convenient, when the campaign trail or state visits demanded it, she was there, the carefully positioned counterpart, smiling just enough, speaking just enough, to reinforce the brand. Her best campaign against online bullying, for instance, drew ridicule from those who pointed to her husband's relentless social media attacks. The contrast made her appear either out of touch or willfully blind. The art of ambiguity. Was she the reluctant First Lady, trapped in an empire of noise? Or was she a strategist, weaponizing silence to shield herself while protecting the Trump legacy? Her carefully controlled public presence allowed both interpretations to thrive, and that ambiguity served her until moments like this one. Under live questioning, stripped away the luxury of silence. The truth is, Melania had rarely been forced into prolonged exchanges with figures who refused to play by the rules of deference. Journalists, for the most part, were cautious, often treating her as a peripheral figure rather than a political actor. But in Congress, especially across from someone like Jasmine Crockett, there was no such courtesy. There was no safe retreat into mystery. Questions demanded answers. And Melania's armor, elegant as it wasn't built for combat. What made her situation even more precarious was the weight of her symbolism. She wasn't simply Melania. She was Trump by extension. Every word she spoke was measured not just against her own image, but against the controversies of her husband. She carried the baggage of birtherism, of border policies, of every remark that had scarred communities. Whether she embraced that role or not, the association was inescapable. And when Crockett leaned in with her sharp voice, she wasn't just addressing a former First Lady, she was confronting an entire legacy. Critics often noted Melania's reliance on optics over substance. She had mastered the long pause, the arched eyebrow, the simple phrases that could be read as profound or evasive depending on the audience. But what worked on a podium or a glossy magazine spread didn't always translate under the raw glare of live testimony. In Congress, silence was not sophistication, it was vulnerability. Pauses left room for interpretation, and interpretations could be brutal. This was the trap of her persona. The very qualities that had shielded her in the public eye: restraint, mystery, elegance became liabilities in an environment where sharpness, clarity, and quick defense were the weapons of survival. Crockett, a lawyer by training, knew how to exploit hesitation. She knew that silence could read as guilt, that ambiguity could be cornered into contradiction. And so, as Melania sat poised, the contradictions of her image hung in the air. Was she the detached figure above the fray? Or was she the enabler, part of the machinery that had bulldozed its way through American politics? The audience watching from home was split, interpreting her calm in whichever way confirmed their beliefs. But in that chamber, facing Crockett's relentless precision, calm was not enough, because Crockett was not interested in ambiguity. She was interested in truth. Truth had a way of slicing through polish, of revealing the cracks that elegance alone could not conceal. But composure can crack, and Crockett knew just where to press. Jasmine Crockett did not step into the halls of Congress by accident, nor did she arrive by playing it safe. Her story is one forged in courtrooms, rallies, and community meetings where stakes weren't theoretical. They were lived realities for people whose voices were often ignored, interrupted, or erased. Long before she leaned forward across that chamber table toward Melania Trump, Crockett had been sharpening her edge, one case, one confrontation, one act of defiance at a time. Her rise began not with privilege, but with persistence. As an attorney, Crockett built her reputation on defending those who had few defenders. She wasn't drawn to the glamorous, high-paying clients. Instead, she took on the cases that most lawyers avoided: the evictions, the unfair arrests, the people targeted because they were poor, black, or immigrant. In those spaces, where silence was demanded and deference expected, Crockett developed her signature style: calm precision, anchored in law, but fueled by an unshakable moral compass. In the courtroom, she was known not for theatrics but for timing. She let arrogance overextend itself. She let lies trip on their own contradictions. And then, with surgical accuracy, she struck a fact, a statute, a precedent delivered at just the right moment. Opposing counsel learned quickly that interrupting her wasn't a way to derail her, it was a way to hand her an opening. She didn't raise her voice unnecessarily, but when she did, it was because she wanted everyone in the room to remember who held the floor. But Crockett's power was never just in her legal training. It was in her ability to carry the weight of others' struggles into spaces that pretended not to see them. When she questioned power, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was channeling the frustrations of parents who had watched their children criminalized for petty mistakes, of immigrants who had been silenced by fear, of communities who had grown used to being talked over. Every case, every hearing, every headline reinforced her central mission: to make sure the people most often dismissed were finally heard. That is why, when she transitioned from law into public office, her supporters followed her with fervor. They recognized in her not a politician chasing spotlight, but an advocate carrying the courtroom fight into the broader arena of democracy. In Congress, her sharpness only amplified. She became a fixture in hearings where Republican bluster clashed with Democratic resistance. And time after time, it was Crockett who refused to let interruptions or dismissals stand unchallenged. What made her presence so electrifying was the contrast. Many in politics avoided confrontation, preferring carefully crafted talking points. Crockett didn't seek confrontation for its own sake, but when it came, she was unflinching. She understood that silence, deference, or polite evasion didn't just cost her. It cost every person watching who needed to see that arrogance could be met and dismantled. Her voice, sharp and unapologetic, became a symbol of defiance, of dignity refusing to bow. The emotional resonance of her journey cannot be overstated. She wasn't simply a congresswoman. She was the embodiment of what representation means. For generations, women, especially women of color, had been interrupted, overlooked, or forced into the background of America's political theater. Crockett, with her courtroom instincts and community roots, stood as a living rejection of that history. Every sharp question, every refusal to yield, every line that cut through bluster was charged with the weight of those who had come before her and those who still struggled to be heard. And so, when she faced Melania Trump, Crockett wasn't just a lawmaker conducting oversight. She was an advocate standing in for millions who understood the sting of being silenced. Melania, with her guarded elegance and cultivated restraint, embodied a different kind of power, one rooted in image, distance, and the privilege of not having to answer. Crockett embodied the counterforce raw truth, grounded in lived experience, unwilling to accept polished silence as an answer. Her rise, then, was not merely about ambition, but about resolve. Resolve to push back when interrupted. Resolve to insist on clarity when power hid behind ambiguity. Resolve to demonstrate that accountability was not optional, no matter how polished the persona across the table. And it was that resolve that would soon slice through Melania's guarded facade. The air inside the chamber thickened with each passing question. Crockett's tone, measured yet relentless, carved through the polite formalities that usually kept hearings from boiling over. She leaned in, her words clipped and precise, each question landing like a stone skipping across still water, sending ripples through the room. "Mrs. Trump," Crockett began, her voice cutting into the hush, "are you prepared to answer directly, or should we assume silence is the strategy?" Melania adjusted in her seat, her face composed into that familiar mask of elegance. Chin slightly lifted, expression controlled, voice soft. "Congresswoman," she replied, carefully measured, "I have always been clear where I stand. My work speaks for itself." The crowd reacted instantly, split cleanly down ideological lines. On one side, conservative allies murmured approval, whispering about her poise and dignity. On the other, progressives bristled, shaking their heads, some muttering under their breath that evasion was not an answer. Crockett didn't flinch. She pressed forward. "Your work may speak, Mrs. Trump, but the American people deserve words from you, not carefully placed silences. So, let me ask again, and this time, I'll expect clarity." Her persistence drew a low rumble of reaction from the audience. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled, and the tension mounted. Melania's hands clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed. The slightest tremor before she lifted her gaze again, still wrapped in an air of grace. "Congresswoman," she answered, "I believe in respect. I will not be dragged into arguments that disrespect this institution." That line drew applause. From her supporters, the kind who praised restraint as strength. Crockett's base wasn't buying it. Online, where snippets of the exchange were already being clipped and circulated, hashtags like hashtag answer the question and hashtag no more deflection began to take off. Viewers could feel the tug-of-war in real time. Silence framed as dignity versus persistence. Framed as accountability. Crockett's eyes never wavered. She let the silence stretch, then leaned in further, voice just sharp enough to pierce the tension. "Respect," she said evenly, "is earned by honesty, not by hiding behind rehearsed lines. So I'll give you one more chance. Will you answer directly, or continue to evade?" The chamber bristled. Even those trying to remain neutral could feel the escalation. This was no longer routine questioning. It was a duel, a collision of personas. On one side, the carefully cultivated elegance of Melania Trump. On the other, the relentless drive of Jasmine Crockett, a woman who refused to let evasion slide. The contrast electrified the room. Conservatives clung to Melania's restraint, whispering about her dignity under fire. Progressives erupted in quiet affirmations of Crockett's boldness, their pride swelling as she gave voice to what many believed but rarely saw expressed in such spaces. Every pause, every deflection, every sharpened question turned the hearing into something larger than testimony. It was performance. It was spectacle. It was a referendum on who had the right to speak without interruption and who had the courage to demand answers. The momentum was shifting, building toward an inevitable breaking point. Crockett's persistence was no longer just about one question. It was about the principle of accountability itself. Melania's elegance, once a shield, now risked becoming a liability if it appeared too much like silence. Reporters exchanged knowing looks. Social media buzzed louder with every second. The confrontation was barreling toward a climax, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Then came the exchange that stopped Melania cold. The room had already been on edge. But when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward for her next line, something in the air shifted. Eyes, unwavering and fierce, locked onto Melania with the intensity of a trial lawyer closing in on the moment that decides the case. This was no longer a volley of questions. It was the decisive strike. "Mrs. Trump," Crockett began, her voice steady but sharp, You've spoken of respect, of dignity, of choosing silence when you see fit. But here's the question the American people deserve answered, under oath, in this chamber, without hesitation. Do you believe that loyalty to your husband absolves you from accountability to the country you claimed to serve as First Lady? The words landed like a hammer. The chamber froze. For a split second, even the clicking cameras halted, as though every lens needed to absorb the weight of that line. Melania blinked, her composure visibly rattled. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. She shifted slightly in, her chair, her fingers tightening against each other. Her trademark poise, that carefully crafted aura of restraint, seemed to crack under the force of Crockett's question. Silence stretched thick and unbearable. Hearing seconds can feel like hours, and each one that passed made the tension sharper. Crockett didn't break eye contact. She didn't rush to fill the void. She simply let the silence expose what words could not. A murmur rippled across the chamber. Porters darted looks at each other. Some supporters of Melania leaned forward, silently willing her to respond. Others sank lower in their seats, sensing the unraveling of the image they had worked so hard to defend. Finally, Melania exhaled softly. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice faintly strained, "I have always stood by my family. That is my choice." It was not an answer to the question. It was evasion cloaked in personal dignity. That was exactly what Crockett was waiting for. "Your choice, Mrs. Trump," Crockett replied, her tone rising just enough to slice through the room, "does not erase the responsibility you carry to the American people. Silence in the face of wrongdoing is not loyalty, it's complicity, and history will remember the difference." The chamber erupted. Gasps shot through the audience. Even some members of the press audibly whispered, stunned by the bluntness of the rebuke. Cameras flashed furiously. The sound of pens scratching paper filled the air as reporters rushed to capture the moment. Melania's face, normally so controlled, betrayed a flicker of unease. Her eyes darted briefly away from Crockett's, then back, as though searching for footing in a storm she hadn't anticipated. She opened her mouth again, but closed it without speaking. In that silence, her image once defined by elegance and untouchability began to fracture. Crockett didn't press further. She didn't need to. The silence was the answer. By refusing to confront the substance of the question, Melania had revealed more than she ever could with words. For a moment, the chamber seemed suspended in time. The audience, the press, the politicians, all were locked in the gravity of what had just unfolded. And then, like a spark igniting dry brush, the reaction spread. Gasps turned into hushed conversations. Fingers flew across phone screens. Clips were already being trimmed, captioned, and shared. On Twitter, hashtags appeared almost instantly. Hashtag complicity's not loyalty. Hashtag Crockett V's. MELANIA. Hashtag Silence Speaks. Within minutes, the moment began trending nationally. TikTok edits layered Crockett's line over dramatic music, cutting between her sharp delivery and Melania's faltering silence. YouTube Shorts replayed the exchange with bold captions. Crockett drops the hammer. Back in the chamber, the ripple effects were undeniable. Conservatives clung to Melania's choice line, spinning it as dignity under attack. But even among some of her defenders, there was discomfort. The lack of a clear response couldn't be hidden, no matter how it was framed. Meanwhile, progressives celebrated the moment as a rare instance where accountability triumphed over polish. Crockett was being hailed as a voice for those too often interrupted, dismissed, or ignored. Was a declaration of principle. Reporters began asking each other the same question. Was this the turning point? Could this moment, one exchange, one silence, redefine the public's perception of Melania's role in Trump-era politics? Crockett, sensing the weight of her words, leaned back slightly in her chair. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply allowed the chamber to sit in the consequence of the question and the silence that followed. That restraint only amplified her authority. Across the country, people watching live coverage sat stunned. In living rooms, offices, and crowded bars, viewers shook their heads, muttered under their breath, or burst into applause. For many, it wasn't about the politics alone, it was about the symbolism. The polished mask of silence and grace had finally been punctured by direct, unapologetic truth. And yet, for all the reaction happening in the moment, something else was brewing. Something that would not be seen until after the cameras stopped rolling. For while the chamber had witnessed a political clash, what came next would reveal the cultural aftershocks that extended far beyond Washington's walls. But what happened after the cameras cut made the moment even bigger. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take minutes. Within seconds of Crockett's devastating line, the internet did what it always does with a moment that cuts through the noise. It exploded. On Twitter, the first hashtag to surge was hashtag CrockettVS, MELANIA. Attached to clips, replayed with captions like, "This is how you hold power accountable." Then came hashtag Silence Speaks, a nod to the way Melania's hesitation carried more weight than any words she might have given, and as progressive accounts and grassroots organizations joined in, third tag, hashtag Furious Congresswoman, spread across feeds, turning Crockett's fire into a cultural rallying cry. TikTok was even faster. Edits popped up pairing Crockett's line, "Silence in the face of wrongdoing is not loyalty, it's complicity," with dramatic soundtracks. Some videos froze on Melania's blank expression, zooming in as text across the screen declared, "That's the look of accountability." Others intercut the exchange with clips of historical figures, framing Crockett as part of a lineage of women demanding truth in the halls of power. The soundbite became an audio trend in itself, layered over skits, animations, and even protest footage. On YouTube, shorts carried bold cinematic titles, "Crockett drops the hammer." Melania left speechless, the line heard around Congress. Within hours, millions of views piled up. Reaction videos from influencers and political commentators stretched across the platform, each one replaying the moment from every possible angle. But it wasn't just the internet's fast-moving machinery. Mainstream voices joined the surge. Commentators on cable news dissected Crockett's line like analysts breaking down the final seconds of a championship game. Some conservative pundits struggled to defend Melania's silence, spinning it as dignified restraint. But the defense sounded thin, especially against the avalanche of praise Crockett was receiving from across the political spectrum. Late-night hosts wasted no time. That very evening, monologues featured Crockett's takedown as the centerpiece. Comedians replaying Melania's pause with comedic timing, then quipping, "When silence says more than 1,000 excuses," the laughter echoed in studio audiences. But beneath the humor was recognition of the deeper resonance. This wasn't just a zinger, it was a cultural mirror. International media picked it up too. Headlines from London to Sydney framed it as a symbolic confrontation. Former First Lady faces fierce questioning. American Congresswoman redefines the exchange of power. On social platforms abroad, Crockett's words were quoted. In multiple languages, proof that the clash had struck a nerve not just in America, but globally. For supporters of Crockett, the moment felt vindicating. Communities long accustomed to being talked over or ignored saw in her calm but unyielding delivery a kind of justice rarely displayed in such public forums. The line became a shorthand for resilience, passed around like a torch in group chats, activist circles, and even classrooms where students dissected the clip for its rhetorical power. For Melania's defenders, the silence was harder to spin. Her carefully curated persona, polished, distant, untouchable, had been pierced by a single, direct question. No matter how many times they tried to reframe it, the image of her hesitation replayed again and again, each share reinforcing the perception of evasiveness. As the memes and applause spread, the moment began to transcend politics. People weren't only talking about Melania or Crockett anymore. They were talking about the larger pattern, about what it means when powerful figures dodge accountability, and what it feels like when someone finally calls it out. The cultural shift was palpable, was no longer framed as just a hearing. It had become a flashpoint in the ongoing story of whose voices matter in America. And in that reframing, Crockett's line was elevated from a pointed question into a universal truth. Still, even as the laughter, praise, and digital creativity flowed, something deeper was stirring. For all the viral edits and hashtags, for all the applause and late-night jokes, the exchange had cracked open a far more serious question, one that lingered long after the chamber emptied and the clip stopped autoplaying. Yet beyond the memes and applause, a deeper question echoed. When the dust settled, Crockett made sure the story didn't rest on one woman's silence. She framed it carefully, with the precision of a lawyer and the empathy of someone who knew what it meant to be dismissed. This wasn't about humiliating Melania Trump. It wasn't about scoring a viral clip or reveling in the applause. It was about something far larger: accountability, truth, and the fundamental question of who gets to be heard in the halls of power. Crockett leaned into the moment. With deliberate framing, she reminded the chamber, and by extension the millions now watching, that silence in politics isn't neutrality. It isn't dignity. Silence, she said, is protection, and too often it protects the powerful at the expense of the people. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Melania's evasive elegance, polished but hollow, against Crockett's sharp clarity, grounded not in performance but in purpose. Her words landed not just as a rebuke to one former First Lady, but as a universal challenge. Silence protects power, but truth protects people. That line, repeated across social media, crystallized what so many felt. The clash wasn't just a skirmish between two figures. It was a battle over values, whether image mattered more than integrity, whether calm detachment could outweigh courage in the pursuit of justice. For progressives, the moment became proof of something deeper, that dignity doesn't mean deference, and accountability isn't cruelty. Crockett embodied a different kind of leadership, one that insisted the voices of the unheard deserved to break through, even when it made the powerful uncomfortable. She had done what generations before her fought to do: demand answers where silence once reigned. And yet the resonance extended far beyond partisan lines. Even some critics who bristled at Crockett's fire admitted that the principle she invoked was unshakable. Every democracy must decide whether truth or performance guides it, whether power is allowed to sit untouched behind walls of silence, or whether it must face the people it claims to serve. The emotional crescendo of the moment wasn't in Crockett's question alone, or in Melania's pause. It was in what came after, in the collective recognition that politics isn't theater, it's responsibility. And responsibility means answering, not avoiding. This was where Crockett left her mark, not as a furious Congresswoman, but as a voice that cut through the fog. Her persistence wasn't anger for its own sake. It was insistence that truth must be spoken, even when inconvenient, even when uncomfortable. And for millions watching, the real question became, who truly deserves the microphone? It all came back to that moment. Melania Trump, silent in her seat, elegance wrapped like armor. Jasmine Crockett, unflinching, demanding answers, with fire in her voice. Then, the line that echoed far beyond those walls, crystallizing. A clash between silence and truth. That was the instant America leaned forward. That was when history felt like it cracked open. If you felt that surge of justice when Crockett spoke, you weren't alone. Millions did. In living rooms, on phones, in crowded feeds, scrolling late at night, people stopped, replayed, and shared the clip. Because it wasn't just a viral exchange, it was validation. It was proof that arrogance could be confronted, that silence could be pierced, that truth could still cut through. And here's the truth. Moments like this don't fade unless we let them. They become movements when we carry them forward, when we amplify them. When we refuse to let dignity be drowned out by deflection or accountability smothered by polish. So if you believe voices like Crockett's matter, if you believe that truth deserves a microphone louder than silence, then join us. Subscribe. Share this. Add your voice to the chorus that says enough to arrogance, enough to empty performance, and yes to dignity. Yes to accountability. Because this wasn't just politics. This was a cultural reckoning. It's a reminder that who speaks and who is silenced shapes not only debates but the very soul of democracy. And the fight over that microphone is far from over. The question lingers, sharp as ever: who truly deserves to be heard?